Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Growth Clean Podcast. My name is Coach Coco, and on today's episode we have Zain Kahn, and we discuss how to leverage storytelling as a content creator, how to be vulnerable online, what kind of content to write about, how to improve your decision making, how games help with decision making, and how your childhood affects your well-being. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the show. Hi Zain Kahn, welcome to the Growth Clean Podcast.
Hey man, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Do you mind telling us a bit about yourself?
Oh yeah, a bit about myself, sure. So by profession, I kind of work in tech. Used to be a marketer, still am a marketer, I guess. Led teams at a few startups, helped a few products grow to a few million users. But outside of that, I'm a pretty big psychology nerd, and psychology is just a fancy word. I just kind of love how people work. What drives people, what moves people, what makes us the same and what makes us different. And, a lot of that is kind of spilled into Twitter. So, I kind of have a Twitter account, which has kind of blown up to over 100,000 people over the last 10 months. Essentially just me talking about, mixture of startups, psychology, and a little bit of marketing here and there.
Yeah. So why do you like psychology?
Why do you like psychology? Good question. So I've kind of lived in a few different countries, not by choice, mostly because I kind of had to. My parents were moving around, and every place that I moved to, I kind of noticed that there were a lot of different things that I was noticing about people, culture, so on. And then there's a lot of similarities that I was noticing as well. So that kind of initially drove me not towards psychology, but just more towards how people work. Psychology just turned out to be the subject that's most gone in most depth into asking how people work and why do they work the way that they do. So for example, I'm originally born in Pakistan. I kind of moved to Switzerland when I was a teenager. And I just thought I'm from Pakistan, these folks are European, worlds apart, kind of different, nothing here in common, and so on. But then kind of remember going down to Spain, and I remember Spain in many ways being more similar to Pakistan than it was to Switzerland.
Yeah.
Right? People like taking siestas. People don't like working long hours. A lot more gestures when they're speaking, much louder. They have dinner very late, similarly how we do in Pakistan. So it was kind of like an eye opener. And then I kind of went back home and I told my parents about this, and my parents were like, "No fucking way." And I'm like, "No, I'm serious. Like they eat dinner at 10 just like us," and they're like, "No fucking way." So that obviously is a small story of where I first started to kind of pick up on these interesting kind of differences, where initially the lazy assumption was maybe this is correlated to race or religion, why Europeans are so different to us. But then I kind of realized there some Europeans aren't really all that different to us, and some Europeans are really different to us, and I don't know what's going on here. So that's kind of me as a teenager kind of stumbling into this.
Yeah. So tell us about, you say you grew a brand in 10 months. How did that happen?
How did that happen? So it initially began without a plan. I'll share how it happened, but initially it was a pandemic. So I currently live in Toronto, Canada. It's a pandemic. I'm stuck at home. There's not a lot to do. All my housemates are kind of stuck abroad during the pandemic as well because they can't fly into Canada. So essentially I was like, you know what, screw it. I'm just going to start putting some tweet outs into the world and kind of see what happens. And, put one tweet out, nothing, put two tweets out, nothing, put 100 tweets out, absolutely nothing. That's no one cares what I have to say. But then I started, focusing on, what other accounts are doing. I started reaching out to other accounts, looked at, how they kind of made it happen. There's, essentially a journey in two things. The first is learning how to write compellingly. So, if you've got an interesting idea, how do you write it in a way that it resonates with someone else? How does it catch someone else's attention, so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
The second part of it is sort of how do you market it, or how do you get distribution for your idea, right? Essentially, how do you make sure that your idea becomes more visible, right? Things like maybe asking people to like or retweet, maybe that's optimizing your profile, maybe that's kind of gently requesting or asking another big account who's friends with you to kind of drop a comment so other people can see it. There's a lot of kind of these small things that can go to it, but essentially I would say it's something like better writing multiplied by getting more eyeballs on it, multiplied by consistency, just posting every day. There's very few days where I haven't posted in the last 10 months. Maybe I was like sick for a few days in between, but I think 99% of the days I've posted something. So
Yeah.
that's kind of, a kind of quick summary of how that Twitter following grew.
Yeah. Speaking of the compelling content you wrote, and there's a thread you did on storytelling. So let's say there's someone with no experience on storytelling, a guy with 0 followers on Twitter is just about to start his social media content creation journey. How do you teach this person to leverage storytelling?
Sweet. So let's kind of, figure out what a story is, right? A story, if you look at the way that humans evolved, first thing when it comes to storytelling, whether that's in school, maybe you're doing some kind of presentation, or maybe that's at work where you need to do some kind of like a presentation or sell someone on a project, or so on. I think everyone's kind of first instinct is to say that I'm going to make a PowerPoint presentation and I'm going to collect all these facts and I'm going to use reason to kind of convince this person. But the reality of the matter is like facts almost never work in terms of convincing us. We're mostly convinced by emotional things, right? And that makes sense, right? So for example, think about it this way, like you're in the Stone Age, and you need to kind of learn that fire is going to hurt you or that lion is going to eat you.
Yeah.
There's no caveman with like a PowerPoint presentation and stats and facts and like, here's like, if you play with the lion, like 89% of the time your hand's going to get bitten off or something, right? Like it's like no one was using facts and figures throughout our evolutionary history for the most part. It was more like, hey man, lion scary, go near, he eat you, you die. Like this is bad shit, man, you should stay away from this lion, right? Or here's a fire, touch fire, ooh, like really bad, it's gonna fuck you up, right? So those are kind of like, that's how we absorb information way better, is we absorb it through information, and then maybe if you supplement it with some facts and some reason, it then does a much better job. So the first thing you kind of need to realize about telling a story is what emotion do you want to optimize for, right? And this might seem a little bit like, of course, like it's something basic that I'm saying, but I think once you decide what emotion you want to go for, everything else becomes a lot easier, right? So there's different forms of storytelling, right? So some people write really amazing blogs, some people write really amazing books, some people give really amazing speeches. Some people can write really good Twitter threads that kind of go super viral and resonate with people. So you got to first pick the emotion that you want to optimize for. On something like Twitter, I always try to heavily optimize for two things. Number one is curiosity, like you want to learn more, like you want to read this thing. And the second emotion that I try and optimize for is value, right? Like I am going to get something, or my life is going to improve in a meaningful way if I read this thread, right? So the thread that, for example, you're talking about, I said, here, I think it was something like, here's 10 tips on becoming a better storyteller, right? So everyone wants to become a better storyteller. It's curiosity. You want to learn how it's done. And number two, there's value, because, if you become a storyteller, that's going to be, great for you. The second thing is the structure of the story, right? It's not always the same, but there are a few structures to the story which do kind of work. I think the most famous structure is the hero's journey, which basically goes like someone, the hero, it could be, man, woman, their life is pretty boring, nothing special is happening. That's part one, until something really exciting happens. Part two begins, right? So think you're Spider-Man, you're Peter Parker, you're a nerd in school, your life is pretty boring, you like this girl, nothing interesting is going on. You get bitten by a spider, boom, suddenly something interesting happens, right?
Yeah.
Then, the hero kind of, meets a challenge, right? So, obviously for Spider-Man, that's finding the person who killed his uncle, or, at school, that's like, the guy who's dating like the girl of his dreams. And then he kind of, has to go uphill. He has to fight this battle. And kind of overcome his demons and defeat his enemy, and then he reaches this place where he finally gets what he deserves, a happy ending, or he becomes a millionaire, or he finds the love of his life, whatever else, or he saves the world, like whatever else that might be, right? So there's something very deep and within us that the structure resonates with us. If you look at every action movie, superhero movie, adventure movie, it's essentially following this arc. So that's, for example, one way, so for example, if you're telling a story about yourself, you're pitching yourself at work or something,
Yeah.
a good way to kind of begin would be, it's like, hey, I was just like a regular old school student in high school, but, one day, I kind of like found this problem and I wanted to kind of build a startup. And, ever since then, I've had this crazy journey building this company or learning this skill or something else. And here's what I've here's how I've become like a different person at the end of it, and here's everything that I've learned, right?
Yeah.
uh, that's a much compelling story than I did these subjects in high school and then I went to college and I did these subjects and this is the GPA that I got. And I learned this and here's why you should hire me, right? That does work as well. It's part of telling the story, but that's not an exciting story. That's the story that everyone else is telling. It doesn't kind of resonate with you emotionally. So uh, those are kind of like my 2 cents around how to tell better stories. Like pick a strong emotion and then try to pick a structure that kind of resonates with it. There's obviously a lot of like tactical stuff. Like, you want to, every story has a core character, so, maybe that's you. Maybe, if you're in marketing or sales, that's the customer, right? So for example, I look at you and I'm like, he's the customer, he or she has a problem. And I'm going to be like, this problem is a pain in your ass. And here's our product or service, and here's how we're going to help you achieve what you want. We're going to help you achieve greatness or something, right? So
Mhm.
look at Nike commercials, right? The core message of every Nike commercial is you can become, you want to become a better player. Want to get better at soccer, at basketball or something else.
Mhm.
And if you wear these Air Jordans or if you wear like these Vapors, you're going to become a better athlete. We're going to help you, the main character,
Yeah.
get to where you want in your journey,
Mhm.
right? A Nike commercial isn't like this Air Jordan has like X% cushion and can make you jump X% higher or all these different things. Reality is it probably like a shoe probably can't do that much for you, if I'm being honest. But that's essentially like they're telling a story, right? Like they've picked you as the character of the story. They've kind of created this narrative arc, like you want to get better and our shoe can kind of help you. And they've kind of picked that emotion as well, which is getting you pumped up. Like for them, it's motivation, right? So the shoe equals motivation equals to you at some point becoming a better player. So those are
Yeah.
kind of my 2 cents around what makes for a good story.
Yeah, but on social media today, people are always sharing their personal stories and all those things. And I feel like the vulnerability aspects, most people aren't ready to be vulnerable, to tell their stories, the things they struggled with, and all those things. So, what is your advice for that?
That's an interesting point. I recently read this book. It's called Plays Well with Others, and it's a book about relationships and not, just like romantic relationships, but, work relationships,
Mhm.
friendships, everything, and so on and so forth. And the really interesting study that I found in there is the thing that correlated most with friendship was the amount of time you spend with someone.
Yeah.
So apparently, if you spend X amount of hours in the first week, you move from acquaintance to a friend. And
Yeah.
then in the second phase, in the next 3 months, if you spend X amount of hours, you move from like a friend to like a good friend. And then if you spend in the next 3 months, if you spend X amount of hours, you move from good friend to best friend.
Mhm.
Which, if you think about it, is probably why it's so easy for a lot of people to make kids when they, make friends when they're younger.
Mhm.
Because when you're in school or when you're in college, you're surrounded by all these people 24/7 in an environment. You're spending so much time with them. It's a lot easier to kind of make friends. But when you move into adulthood, that becomes a little bit harder, right? You're not spending that much time with people, and the people that you spend time with a lot tend to be at work, and work is more of a transactional thing than kind of
Mhm.
um, that sort of thing. But the second kind of key thing that he talked about, which kind of correlated with building stronger friendships and more friendships, was vulnerability,
Mhm.
right? So vulnerability being the fact is, I think when a lot of us meet people, our default reaction is to demonstrate value,
Yeah.
right? It's being like, I'm XYZ and I went to Harvard and I'm like an investment banker at some, big bollocks bank. And, here's what you should kind of care about me and everything. And that's fine. But the problem is like that usually rubs people the wrong way,
Yeah.
right? If you're at work, that's an awesome thing because if you're having a work transaction, then it is transactional, and whatever value you can bring to the table and whatever value I can bring to the table, and that's kind of
Mhm.
the basis for us being friends and kind of having a business relationship.
Yeah.
But in a personal sense, you want to be able to relate to another person, right? You want to be able to sense that they're human, like they have flaws, that they have weaknesses, that they have good and bad days, just like you. So when you're talking to another person, I would say inside of work, but outside of work, appearing human, being vulnerable, sharing the sides of you that aren't so perfect, kind of makes room for a much more relaxed and open and perhaps an emotional conversation as well, right?
Yeah.
So if you kind of jump into a conversation being like, I'm a big time Charlie, and these are all the things that you've done, you essentially define the conversation as, what's the right word for it? As transactional,
Yeah.
right? It's hard to be vulnerable inside that conversation because you don't want to say anything as a second person in that conversation that kind of makes you appear lower value, for example, right?
Yeah.
But if you kind of make the conversation more about, hey, like, quick second about like, here's what I work and here's what I do, but here's like a few things that I'm interested in life, or here's my hobbies outside of work, or I have 2 kids that I really, really love, and they're the most important thing in my life.
Yeah.
Suddenly that opens up new angles in the conversation, new kind of directions that help you be more vulnerable, that help you be more relaxed, and that just made the conversation less transactional, I'd say. And I say this probably because I'm someone in my 20s, and this is the time in your life where things can get pretty transactional. So those are just like my 2 cents on if you want to build trust with someone, if you want to kind of tell a better story about yourself, if you want to get the other person to like you, then vulnerability might be a better kind of way to go about it than demonstrating credibility.
Yeah, or in terms of building a personal brand on the internet, because I've had people on Twitter DM me telling me about how shy they were to share their personal stories because their friends are following them and all of those kind of things. And
Yeah.
usually I advise them to open a new account and just start from zero and just share when nobody's watching or something. So what's your opinion?
Let me make sure I'm getting this correctly. So you want to ask me, what should someone do if they're starting on Twitter in terms of being vulnerable and building an audience and so
Yes,
forth?
exactly.
So there's 2 sides to this, right? So part of Twitter is transactional. Part of Twitter is people wanting to see who you really are, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the first part there is you, I mean, you can just kind of talk about anything you want, but just because you're interested in something doesn't mean someone else is going to be interested in that thing.
Yeah.
Right. So the fact is like, first you start off with the point where you make sure that you're talking about things that you're interested in,
Mm-hmm.
but make sure that there are also other people who are interested in the thing that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Right. So for example, I am passionate about, marketing, psychology, all these different things.
Yeah.
I know that a lot of other people are kind of interested in these things as well. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a common ground that we can talk about. If you look at other things, are people interested in what I have for breakfast? Are people interested in, what I kind of think about politics? Probably not. And I don't really talk about these things because, I don't have any credibility. There's no reason for me to kind of especially listen to me on this topic. So I kind of stay away from these things, right?
Yeah.
So that's number one, is not kind of, being fake to the point where you're talking about something that you're not interested in, because, that's just disingenuous.
Mm-hmm.
But then also not being, kind of self-absorbed to the sense where you're literally talking about things like, I didn't like the new Spider-Man movie, or my cereal this morning was really bad, and those kinds of things. Because it's like, come on, man, like it's a bit narcissistic, right? Like you want to talk about something that other people find interesting as well, right? So it's got to be somewhere in between those 2 poles, those 2 extremes. So I think that's number one. I think another kind of thing that I find is helpful is, it's not about just about sharing your wins, it's about sharing your losses as well.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're kind of open about the fact, it's like, I did something real cool in life, like I became an athlete, or I became like a professional in something, or I made a lot of money, or I, got really fit and took care of my health. It's not just about, everything that went right. It's also about sharing everything that went wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's about saying, I had bad days. There were days where I didn't feel like working out. There were days where I had fights with my colleagues. There were, days where I didn't really have that much money, and I made this bad financial decision on the way to becoming rich. And here's what I learned from it.
Mm-hmm.
People like love these things, right? So the first thread that kind of went viral for me, completely, by chance, was I just like wrote a quick thread thing, I've kind of progressed pretty quickly in my career, and here's 10 things that I've kind of learned along the way. And all of those things weren't just, like, here's the skill that you need to learn to kind of become rich or something. A lot of it was just about, here's like some really like tough lessons that I kind of learned along the way that I kind of wish I'd known about sooner, right?
Yeah.
People really resonated with that. It kind of went hyper viral. I think 2 million people read it. It's back when I had only 300 followers, right? So in one day, I kind of went from 200 followers to almost 4,000 followers just because I wrote that thread. Now, that's
Yeah.
not going to be the journey that everyone has, but that's, kind of like a lesson or an insight that I got early on. Another kind of place to be kind of vulnerable and kind of be open with people is in the comments. I think, it's a great opportunity to kind of interact with people, learn what they have to say, kind of, make the conversation more interesting,
Mhm.
in my opinion. And then, obviously another thing is I think a lot of people are scared of this is just reach out to people who have a bigger audience on Twitter. Just say hi, start a conversation with them. I think one thing to be careful with there is people who have really big accounts, people who are over like 50 or 100K probably get so much inbound messages that it's really hard to kind of keep on top of every single conversation. It's
Mhm.
just the reality of it. It's just so much volume that it's hard to deal with. But if someone has like 5,000 followers, 10, 15, 20, 25,000 followers, just reach out to them. Just be like, hey man, kind of, I've been reading your tweets, think they're really enjoyable. I'm kind of on the way of like, building an audience or learning this stuff myself. Would love to chat sometime, or, would love to kind of help you out in any way if I could. People appreciate that. It's what I did. It's what a lot of people kind of did for me as well. And it's when you're starting out, it's intimidating. Like even reaching out to an account that has 5,000 followers when you have 0 followers is like a little bit scary.
Yeah.
The
I
reality is
remember.
like, yeah, the reality is like that person who has 5,000 followers or 10 to 20,000 followers was in the exact same position that you were like
Yeah.
2 3 6 months ago.
Mhm.
They understand what you're going through. They wish that there was someone there to help them, and there often was. And they want to kind of pay it forward, and they want to help you as well, right? So for me on Twitter right now, like right now, I'm obviously friends with a lot of folks who kind of help me along the way, accounts that are bigger than me or the same size. But half of my conversations are accounts that are smaller than me, accounts that literally started tweeting 2 3 months ago, have less than like, 2 3 thousand followers. They just
Yeah.
reached out there like, hey Zane, like, we're building an audience. What advice can you offer us? I'm like, here you go. And we kind of just, struck up a relationship and I guess low key friends in some ways now. So those are kind of my 2 cents on how to be more vulnerable, how to be more authentic if you're online and you're trying to build an audience.
Yeah. So I was reading under of your thread where you spoke about how you can improve your decision making through playing strategy games. Would you mind talking about that?
Sure, that's a great question. Is let's first talk about why is it even important to make better decisions.
Okay.
Um, and a lot of it might seem kind of obvious as if I can make better decisions, my life is going to be better and so on and so forth. I think that is true. I think what's unappreciated about good decision making is the compounding effect.
Yeah.
So if your decisions are 1% better every day, you're gonna be a beast by the end of the year or the decade or whatever your timeline is for what you're doing, right? So
Mhm.
for example, if your diet is 5 or 10% better than the average person out there, chances are you're gonna outlive them by 5 to 10 years. This isn't like a scientific thing. This is just a general observation. Perhaps a more accurate one would be if your financial decisions are better than the next person by 5 to 10%, which basically means that your portfolio returns 5 to 10% more than the average person over the course of your life, you are going to make millions of dollars more than that person,
Mhm.
right? You're going to make millions of dollars more than that person over the course of your life. So I think having like small gains in decisions and making even slightly better decisions goes an extremely long way into the quality of your life across any dimension that you want to measure it on, right? um so that's kind of like my pitch for why anyone should try to get better at decision making. And then sorry, I'm kind of forgetting about what your question was. Were you asking me like how to get better at decisions or?
Yeah, you said playing strategy games helps make
Yeah.
better decisions.
Interesting. Yes. So now it's about, how do you improve your decision making, right?
Mhm.
So I find that to be pretty difficult thing because there's very few situations in life on a daily basis where you need to test your decision making,
Yeah.
right? Where you get to build up that skill, right?
Mhm.
Like on any given day, most of our decisions are pretty mundane and pretty low stakes. Like, what clothes should I wear? What should I eat for breakfast? Where should I go out for dinner? So on and so forth. You don't really get to practice that decision making at a very high level. You do get to practice it at work to some degree, but even at work, it often ends up being like decisions around how to prioritize your time more often than not, right? Like, what am I going to work on today and so forth. There's just not a lot of multivariable, high-paced, short time frame decision making. So it's really hard to kind of, pack in and become better at it. I think a good example of this is a good kind of, proxy for decision making is something like chess. Even though I'm not a big fan of chess as a strategy game, if you were just playing chess for 1 minute a day, if you were just making one move a day, that's a very slow way of learning chess, right?
Yeah.
So in a way, like only making a couple of high stakes decisions a day or medium stakes decisions a day is a very like slow, cumbersome, inefficient of getting better at decision making. The question is like, what are some environments in which I am forced to sit down, in which there are some high stakes, and I'm forced to make better decisions, right? So for a very long time in history, there were two ways to do this, or three ways to do this. Number one was gambling. Do not recommend you do that, right? So there's better ways to kind of learn how to be better at decision making besides that kind of losing all your money in one night. The kind of second way, I guess, is war, right? So if you swing the sword wrong, or if you get your strategy wrong, you're going to be killed on the battlefield. So you need to kind of learn how to make better decisions instantly, right? Again, I don't recommend kind of dropping yourself in a war zone just to learn how to make better decisions.
Yeah.
And then the kind of final one I think is games. And for the longest time, that's kind of been chess in more Western cultures, and games like Go in more Eastern cultures. So I think those were like initially how people learn how to make better decisions in a short amount of time. Now, even though I'm a fan of chess, the reason why I don't like chess so much anymore is chess comes with a lot of memorization, right? And the thing is, I don't think that reflects real life, in the sense that there's just not a lot of memorized stuff that you need to do on a daily basis, right? So if I ask you to kind of make better decisions about your diet, or about your relationship, or about your investment portfolio, memorization just doesn't help that much, right? Maybe it's the first 10-20% where you at least want to understand the basics of good nutrition, or how interest rate works, or being a better listener or something. But beyond that, it's like you're making decisions on the fly, right? Like the stock market just tanked like a couple of weeks ago, right? What do you do, right? So the memorization isn't going to help, right? Like every time the stock market goes down, it goes down in a new, unique way that you hadn't anticipated before. Because if you could have anticipated it, then the stock market probably wouldn't have gone down if everyone could have anticipated it. So I think from that perspective, you want to test your decision making in an environment which is as close to real life as possible. There's hard to find an environment that's one-to-one real life, but I think the closest thing to that then is video games and strategy games. So when you're forced to play like a board game like Catan, or if you're forced to play, or if you're not forced, but like you're forcing yourself to play a game like StarCraft, or Age of Empires, or whatever else it is that you're into, you are then saying, okay, for the next hour, I am probably going to make more high stakes decision than I would in a given week or a given month. So you're compressing all that learning about how to make better decisions in that small amount of time. And these games are great because there's a lot of dimensions that you need to think about, right? So, you need to think about the first thing that I like is it makes you think long-term, right? So in any given kind of day, you're mostly focused on short-term things, like I need to get my chores done, I need to kind of hand in my assignment, or I need to kind of finish this thing on my job. In a strategy game, you always have to think like 20 steps ahead, right? So in a way, you're like, okay, I want to win this game, and I need to think 20 steps ahead, and how I line my pieces up now, and how I kind of start attacking my opponent or build up my resources. That's going to happen right now.
All right.
Number one, sorry, go ahead.
So another question from another thread I saw was the common question: how to live a happy life? Because you said your childhood goes a long way to helping you live a happy life. And I've written a lot of threads about how your childhood affects your happiness and all those kind of things. So do you mind talking about that before we leave?
Sure, awesome. Yeah. So now you're talking about a thread that I wrote. It was basically a translation of a study that was done at Harvard. So this is the longest running study one of the longest running studies in social science, definitely the longest running study on like kind of happiness and well-being, in which they attract a couple of hundred men and over the course of their lives, and then they basically saw what contributed to their happiness or well-being across a bunch of different dimensions. So like health, relationships, money, where they live, all these kind of different kind of things. And the key thing there is the biggest determinant of our happiness or well-being is our relationships, right?
Yeah.
So relationships were a good predictor of how long you're going to live. Bad relationships were almost as bad as cigarettes and alcohol when it comes to taking years off your life, right?
Yeah.
So loneliness is just a bigger killer as being a chain smoker or being an alcoholic, right? So that was like the big key takeaway. First is relationships, but the relationships that seem to matter most in terms of determining your life direction were those in childhood, right? So if you had a good childhood, if you had good parents, a stable upbringing, not a lot of traumatic events, so on and so forth, where you weren't worried about food or money or being physically beaten up or something, chances are you're going to do reasonably well in life compared to people who didn't have that in their childhood.
Yeah.
So that's good news for those people that had a good childhood and bad news for people who didn't have a great childhood. But the study does show if you grow older, you can actually compensate for that a little bit by nurturing the next generation. So if you decide to have children, or if you decide to kind of become a teacher, or if you decide to kind of mentor or help the next generation in a meaningful way, that actually compensated for a lot of the not so happy or great things that could have happened in your childhood, right? Because you're helping someone else kind of become a better version of themselves in their younger years. So people who kind of did that reported much better scores for well-being, happiness, and for longevity as well, I think. So those would be kind of my kind of two insights. If you're a parent, make sure that your child has had a great childhood. If you're an adult and you haven't had a great childhood, try to maybe have kids or participate in the community, or in whatever meaningful way you can help the next generation. So those are kind of my 2 cents around on that.
Yeah, it's been an exciting conversation with you. And where can people find you on the internet?
So the main way you can find me is on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Heykahn, so HEYKAHN. If there's anything you want to talk about, anything you'd like to discuss, you can always shoot me a DM. That's probably the best way to get to me. There's other stuff like LinkedIn and stuff, but I never check LinkedIn, so probably kind of get that. So yeah, best place to hit me up is Twitter.
All right, man. Thank you for coming to the show.
Yeah, man. Of course. Thanks for having me.
Hey guys, thanks for coming this far. For my daily content, find me on Twitter @GrowClinic, and that's with 2 C's at the end, or check out my personal website